Hello, my name is Will Zalecki, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
On Tuesday, February 26th, Chicagoans went to the polls to vote for their next mayor. With no candidate receiving a majority of the votes, the two frontrunners will proceed to a runoff election on April 2nd.
In what at first looked like a record low voter turnout election, but later proved to be just an average low voter turnout election, the people made their voices heard. Bill Daley, the son and brother of former mayors, as well as the candidate many presumed would be the frontrunner, did not make it into the runoff. Instead, Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle took the lead. Regardless of which candidate is the winner, hers will be a historic victory. The next Chicago mayor is going to be the first African-American woman to hold that office.
Our guest today, Laura Washington, is a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, a political analyst for Chicago's ABC 7 News, and a commentator on NPR and Chicago Public Radio. In 1985, Washington was appointed deputy press secretary for Harold Washington, Chicago's first African-American mayor. She gives us her insights into how we got where we are in this election cycle and how April's runoff is likely to play out.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts, I'm Kyra Sturgill.
I'm Steve Crano.
This is Chicagoland.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Laura Washington, thank you so much for being our guest today on Chicagoland. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
I'm Laura Washington, a lifelong Chicagoan, columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, analyst on ABC 7, and having a lot of fun with this mayor's race. This is the mayor's race of a lifetime.
Great. That is the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. Also, most recently, you are a fellow at the Institute of Politics at University of Chicago. We'll come back to that later. To start off, we're living in a historic time. As you mentioned, Chicago is going through an amazing election. We're about to have our first black female mayor. Either Toni Preckwinkle or Lori Lightfoot will be elected. From your perspective as a journalist, a political journalist in Chicago, just how momentous is this occasion and how are Chicagoans processing this?
Well, for me, this is as momentous as the Harold Washington election of 1983 for different reasons, because this has taken way too long for us to get to this point, and I didn't expect us to get to this point this soon. It reminds me of the Obama election, which I stupidly predicted was never going to happen, maybe a year and a half or so out. I think it's time for another woman leader in the city, and the fact that to have not one but two African-American women who are supremely qualified, and one of them is also an openly gay person, is just a stupendous development, and something that it snuck up on us in this last round, but now we've had the luxury of 5 weeks to sort of just enjoy this, whereas with Harold Washington, it was a shocker, and no one saw that one coming.
So how might either Lori Lightfoot or Toni Preckwinkle govern differently than past mayors of Chicago?
Well, they're women, first of all, so I think that they're going to be more collaborative. They're going to be less top-down, which will be a really big change from Rahm Emanuel, who was very much a top-down, very focused, controlled mayor. I think it's just women are more collaborative. I think they're both avowed progressives, reformers. They see themselves as outsiders. Some might quibble with either side of that question, depending on which candidate you're talking about. So they're going to be very much like Harold Washington. They're going to come in with a mandate to change. There's not going to be any expectations. It will be business as usual. So that means City Hall will be up for grabs, much as it was during the Harold Washington era, but hopefully in a more peaceful, stable way than it was last time around.
No more council wars.
Council. You know what? I think I always thought the council wars got a bad rap because it was democracy in action. Maybe some of the motivation behind it wasn't pure. Maybe some people think that the Harold Washington's enemies were racially motivated, but they were demanding to have control and access of government from the mayor. And that was the only time in my lifetime when there was a balance between the city council and the mayor. The mayor wasn't running everything. Harold Washington didn't like that, but the council had a lot more influence than it's had before or since then.
Leading up to the February 26th election, I think a lot of people were speculating that it would be Daley and someone else in the runoff. So was the outcome something that you expected? Were you completely surprised? And what do you think paved the way for two progressive women to be in the runoff?
Well, I think anyone who says they could have predicted it was going to be Lightfoot and Preckwinkle is fooling you. I thought it was going to be Daley and one of the women, because the other thing that's historic about this campaign it wasn't just Lightfoot and Preckwinkle. We had 5 women of color running for competitive women of color. So, yes, I thought it was going to be one of those women with Daley, although I was feeling within the last week that Lori Lightfoot was gaining serious momentum, so I wasn't totally shocked when she was able. I was shocked that she came in first. I think it says a lot because it says that people are embracing change in a way that's profound. These 2 women are more different from any of the other candidates that are running, and they're certainly light years away from the current occupant of the mayor's office. So I think the fact that they're 2 women, the fact that they're progressive women, is a really important message.
Do you think this was sort of a lucky situation, how this turned out, or do you think this is really indicating that voters wanted a change?
I think it was a combination of things. I think 14 people in the race made it very hard for a lot of voters to distinguish beyond the top 4 or 5 folks. And so that gave advantage to those folks who were, who had more name recognition, who were doing fairly well in the polls. I think that there is a movement in this country. There is a lot of blowback from the Trump election, a lot of blowback from the way Rahm Emanuel governed, that sort of top-down controlled downtown establishment way of governing. And I think that that's reflected in the fact that the 2 top people were from the more progressive end of things. I think that there was a lot of vote splitting and strategic voting. I think there were a lot of folks that voted for Preckwinkle because they wanted to see her up against Daley, because the expectation is there would be Daley. And I think there's other folks that wanted to see a woman of color be in the mix. And, one of the things you don't hear a lot talked about is that Daley had competitors who would be competing for his base, which would be presumed to be more white, ethnic, Northwest Side, Southwest Side. So I think that depressed his vote as well. The Jerry Joyces and the Bob Fiorettis were able to pull some of the vote away from him that probably kept him out of the runoff.
So now looking at the runoff race and how it's gotten started, it seems like it's gotten off to a pretty negative start. And it seems like a lot of that is coming from the candidates trying to reveal herself as the true progressive in the race. Do you think that either of these candidates fit this title? And why do you think it's gotten off to such a negative start already?
I think that both candidates fit the title. I think that there's been critiques of Toni Preckwinkle's close alliance with the Democratic Party machine, which I think doesn't really exist much anymore. I mean, I think that there's still remnants of it, but it's not really the powerful entity that it once was. But she started out from Hyde Park as a reformer, as a progressive. She was one of only a handful of aldermen that voted against that terrible parking meter deal that is sort of the symbol, the icon of progressive politics in Chicago. So she has the history. She can cite chapter and verse far better than I can why that's the case. Lori Lightfoot is an outsider in the sense that she's never, been an elected official. She's never run a government. She comes from a more progressive background in terms of her advocacy for police reform and police accountability. So I think they both can claim that mantle. The negativity, I think, comes out not just about the debate about who's the most progressive of the reformer, but the idea of having to bring down the other one's numbers in order to win. And I think that's politics 101, unfortunately. And when you're in a tight competitive race like this, every negative flaw, every critique is going to get magnified. I think it's unfortunate because it shouldn't get personal. These two women both have very good records to run on. They have a lot to say about policy and public engagement in the city, and they should talk more about that. And I'm disappointed that they're not doing that.
Is this the norm for mayoral runoffs in the past? Have they been this close? Has there been this much?
No, that's a great question, because that may say good things about where our city is. That the voters are much more engaged. The last time around, it was Rahm Emanuel and Chuy Garcia, and Chuy Garcia was truly the David before the Goliath, and many people didn't give him a chance from the very beginning. He was outmatched. Money, outmatched endorsements, outmatched in terms of his name recognition. And in this case, I think you have two women who are more evenly matched, and people on both sides of these two women who are super engaged and super excited about this race.
So I'm sure you've seen the recent poll that heavily favors Lori Lightfoot. I think it's 60 to Preckwinkle's 30.
That's her poll, too. Take
it with a little grain of salt. Regardless, can you share any of your own thoughts about where each candidate is likely to do well? For example, Lightfoot performed fairly poorly in the south and west sides of the city in the first round. What are the events that she and Preckwinkle are going to have to go to win over the districts that they didn't win in the first round? Who are they going to have to talk to? What communities are they going to have to be reaching out to?
Well, I think that what Toni Preckwinkle has been pushing is the idea that she's going into neighborhoods and having meetings with voters. A lot of those meetings are not open to the media, or they're not open to the public, but she will say, I'm really reaching out. Lori Lightfoot is, I think, pushing harder on getting high-profile endorsements, getting high-profile donors. You're right, Lori Lightfoot did very well. It's so interesting, and it says a lot about the diversity of our city that she did best on the north side, on the North Lakefront, on the near northwest side, which is mostly white. And I think that's due largely not so much that she's more appealing to that vote, but that she just wasn't as well known. She wasn't as well known on the south and west sides, and she's trying to change that. Toni Preckwinkle did very well in the African American wars, although she did come in first, even in the African American wars. Willie Wilson did. She's got to continue to stoke up that base, the black voter, particularly the older black voter, but she's got to obviously do more outreach on the North Lakefront, because that used to be her territory. That's progressive territory, and I think she's lost some of that support because of some of the scandals that she's been closely associated with.
So looking at this race a little bit more broadly, what does this mean for Chicago kind of as a major city in the United States?
I think Chicago has long been seen as the capital of corruption in America. More than 30 aldermen have gone to prison in the last several decades. So when you have two candidates who, for the most part, don't have any ties to that corruption and who are claiming that they're going to bring change and ethics and goodwill and social justice to City Hall, I think that sends a huge message to the rest of the world that maybe Chicago is finally ready for reform. So there's that. I think that Chicago is probably the capital of anti-Trump sentiment in this country. Donald Trump will not come to Chicago. He uses every opportunity he can to badmouth Chicago and denigrate Chicago. So to have two African-American women rise up, I think that's no accident. I think that there's this real progressive, change-oriented, social justice-oriented streak that they're reflecting. And I think that that's going to be seen as a beacon outside of Chicago for the rest of the country. If Chicago goes this way, so can perhaps the rest of the country.
Do you remember feeling that same way when Harold Washington was elected?
Well, Harold Washington was much more of a Chicago experience. I think Chicago was a pretty racist town back in those days. It's segregated now, but it was even more so back then. The politics was very oppressive for African Americans and Latinos. And so to have someone like a Harold Washington rise up above that and be able to bring together a multiracial coalition in a city that had never that had so many racial divides was just really profound. And I think it was a brilliant opportunity and a brilliant moment for Chicago.
In addition to a mayoral race, there's also an aldermanic race that has revealed that maybe corruption is not all gone in the city of Chicago. We still have this tendency to stick with the old machine ways sometimes. Were you surprised by the re-election of Ed Burke? And does it indicate that the city moved forward in some ways but backwards in others?
I think we're pretty cynical about our politicians. As I mentioned, we've had a lot of aldermen go to jail. We've had a lot of aldermen be indicted. And I think we as voters in Chicago become a little bit too blasé about it. And I think there's also this aura that Ed Burke has, that he continues to be powerful. And I think people